Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Time Traveler's Handbook. Today we are going to be diving into kind of a universe definition for Doctor Who. We've talked a lot about Doctor Who over the last couple of months, and I want to kind of try to compile the notes together in this 4-part series on how do we define the universe of Doctor Who. We know that it's not strictly deterministic, but we also know that there are examples of determinism in this show. So first we're going to be talking about kind of what the universe looks like, the locations that appear in the universe. Then we'll go into those examples of determinism, as I mentioned previously, and then we'll talk about time loops and how they are structured in Doctor Who, and then we'll go over the rules and the methods of time travel in the final episode. Everything that happens in Doctor Who is set in the Prime universe, except for the events that happen in the Solid Tract universe, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The Prime universe contains multiple different timelines, sub-universes, and then a classification for the space in between. The primary timeline that the characters of the show exist in is called the main timeline. There are rules that a time traveler has to follow within the main timeline, mainly that they cannot visit a moment that they have previously traveled to, since that would cause a paradox, and they cannot let one person or entity who is the same as a previous version of themselves come in contact with each other. These things will cause paradoxes, and there are 3 prominent examples of paradoxes that are maintained in the Doctor Who universe during the run of the show. Paradox timelines are a version of an alternate timeline that branches away from the main timeline in Doctor Who. These timelines occur when a paradox occurs and is a mechanism that the universe of Doctor Who uses to prevent the main timeline from being destroyed. Essentially, a paradox timeline is the result when a universe splits from the main timeline that the paradox occurs in into a different timeline, quarantining the paradox until it's resolved. We have 3 prominent examples of a paradox timeline occurring in Doctor Who that I'll talk about today. Primarily, these episodes are Father's Day, The Last of the Time Lords, and The Wedding of River Song, all of which have different circumstances in which they occurred and in which they were resolved. Father's Day happens because Rose breaks the first rule of time travel within the main timeline. You can never interact with an event that you have already visited in the main timeline. Because of this, Rose and the Doctor end up revealing themselves to a previous version of themselves, which is an event that did not previously happen to their previous versions. This caused the main timeline to branch into a paradox timeline, which required Rose's father to die in order to re-establish main timeline status. When he does die, the timeline reverts back to the main timeline, restoring its original order. Now, we can only theorize on how time passes in this area because it's a relatively short time that they're there, but my postulation is that time is frozen in that moment because the day cannot continue without Rose's father dying. It's also worth noting that a case where Rose came in contact with a younger version of herself within this paradox timeline accentuated the problem and made things a lot worse when that happened. Next, in The Last of the Time Lords, the Master causes a grandfather paradox, meaning that the descendants of humans traveled back in time to kill their ancestors. Because this is a fatalistic universe, this means that the descendants would never have existed to travel back and commit the act. The reason why they are able to do this is because the Master has constructed what is known as a paradox machine, which is able to maintain the paradox timeline he has created. When the paradox machine is destroyed, the timeline reverts back to when the machine was first switched on, re-merging itself with the main timeline and bringing back everyone that was affected. Finally, in The Wedding of River Song, River is destined to kill the Doctor during a prescribed event that was witnessed by the other time travelers. But she stops this from happening, and as a result, this is preventing a fixed point that is directly related to time travelers from happening, and this causes a paradox, resulting in time stopping until the moment when River shoots the Doctor. This alternate timeline exists in parallel with the main timeline, and this event causes all of history to be rewritten within the paradox timeline to be happening at the same time. Since the time has always been frozen, in the same place in this paradox universe. When the paradox is resolved, the paradox timeline ceases to exist and time continues as normal. So we can see here that in most cases, paradox timelines stop time, and then when they are resolved, when those paradoxes are resolved or the universe is destroyed, we get reverted back to the main timeline at the exact same time. In addition to paradox timelines, there are other methods in which alternate timelines are generated within the Doctor Who universe. We'll call these alternate timelines, and they are timelines that have just branched off from the main timeline of Doctor Who. These are primarily created due to key events being changed from the main timeline back in time. It's worth noting that alternate timelines can and usually turn into main timelines depending on which universe the time travelers currently occupy. This is evident in episodes like The Water of Mars, where the Doctor can change a key event which alters the course of the future from then on out. He was previously in the main timeline, having known the things that would happen in the future from this event, but he now exists in an alternate timeline with new information about what happened on the day that he changed things. The main timeline in this case has changed to the alternate version of reality that he has created. So this is what usually happens when a time traveler goes to an area. They'll change things and then the future is affected, and that means they have branched off into an alternate timeline. There are two prominent examples of alternate timelines that do not turn into the main timeline. The first one being the universe from Rise of the Cybermen, which we will dub the Cyberman timeline. This timeline was unintentionally traveled to by the Doctor, resulting in the near death of the TARDIS in the process for having crossed the void to get there. This is a timeline that has branched sometime in the past of the main timeline, although it's unclear when that happened and is never explained. A rift between these two timelines is created from this jump, which is essentially a way to travel between two timelines that should otherwise not exist. The rift is closed in later episodes when the Cybermen attempt to use it to invade the main timeline, and the Doctor has to close it in order to stop this from happening. The void is another element of the main universe that we'll talk about later. The other example of an alternate timeline is the Time Beetle timeline that occurs in Turn Left. This alternate timeline is the result of a time beetle causing Donna Noble to mentally travel back in time and influence the events that happened that led her to the Doctor. The influence of these events caused a change in a key event, resulting in the Doctor not meeting Donna and thus ending up perishing at the hands of an enemy that they had faced together. This creates an alternate timeline from that point forward, with the Time Beetle intending on making this the main timeline and causing the perishing of the Doctor once and for all. However, Donna, with the help of Rose, travels back in time again from this universe to cause Donna to re-influence the event that caused her to branch the timeline, and inevitably causes the alternate timeline to re-merge with the main timeline, as if the event had never been influenced in the first place. While this would typically go against the rules of the Doctor Who universe, namely you can't interact with an event you have already witnessed, Donna was able to re-interact with this event by not directly interacting with herself and indirectly changing the outcome, causing a new way for Donna to make the right decision and re-merge the timeline. So, anything that branches off of the main timeline is either a paradox timeline or an alternate timeline, both of which are basically entirely separated from the main timeline from that point forth and come around by either changing a fixed event or causing another kind of paradox. Again, they are able to be traveled to, but in general, timelines other than the main timeline are hard for the TARDIS and other time machines to travel to. Within the main timeline, there are connections to sub-universes that exist in conjunction with the main universe. They are still made of the main universe, but they have different properties than the main universe, meaning that they have a sort of symbiotic relationship with the main universe. These universes are called pocket universes. With all of these pocket universes, there are common rules. The first and most prominent rule is that time and space work differently within the pocket universes. So they have their own set of rules for how time and space work. The second is that these pocket universes typically have one way in and one way out, although they have been known to be able to traverse into multiple directions, as we'll discuss later. The point is that a pocket universe has to have a specific way to enter them, and you cannot enter them without taking some sort of action to get there. As such, traveling to these pocket universes without an extraordinary amount of energy or going through a pathway already set up for this universe is virtually impossible. We've already talked at length about the most prominent pocket universe, which is the TARDIS. It's the perfect example of a place that doesn't follow the normal rules of time and space from within it, as it essentially exists in a world of its own, and as we can see from Journey to the Center of the TARDIS, time can behave in a labyrinth-like manner within it as well. So both space and time have unique rules within the TARDIS. Additionally, the only way to get in and out of the TARDIS without a huge amount of energy, or another way to bypass it, is the TARDIS key, which can open the door to the TARDIS or summon the TARDIS in other ways. This pocket universe is unique in that it can move its single door to wherever and whenever it wants, which is what makes it a time machine and what the Doctor can use to travel through space and time. This does give it the capability to travel to alternate timelines as well, but it has a much more difficult time doing so, and it takes a large amount of energy, again, to achieve the task. If a paradox occurs where the TARDIS could be left in the main timeline away from the paradox timeline, leaving the outside a meaningless shell. Going to other pocket universes behaves similarly, where it takes a large amount of energy to perform, but it can be done by the TARDIS typically. Let's start talking about examples of pocket universes used in Doctor Who, all of which have unique properties. Let's start with dream universes, which appear in Amy's Choice. Dream universes are just dreams, but you can think of dreams as a place your consciousness can go to that doesn't follow the normal rules of space and time. This is a loose-fitting pocket universe definition, almost just on technicality, but in this particular case, all three of the main characters were connected in some way, meaning that there must have been some sort of metaphysical location for them to all be located in the meantime. Next, we have what I'll call the house universe, which appears in The Doctor's Wife. This is described as a universe outside of the universe, or a true literal pocket dimension, as this place exists for the sole purpose of trapping Time Lords. This seems to take advantage of the fact that the TARDIS is the only way to travel outside of the universe and into a universe like this, and this does seem to still be tied to the main universe, as the coexistence of things within the main universe and the pocket universe does not cause instability when mixed. We'll talk a bit about the Solitract universe where that is the case later. Next is the Pandorica universe, occurring in the Big Bang, and it's an interesting example of a pocket universe that disguises itself as an alternate timeline. This universe was created from the imprisonment of the Doctor in the Pandorica, preventing the Doctor from being able to save the universe and everything else in the universe. This is basically the result of changing the whole sequence of key events that come from the future for the Doctor, and in conjunction with the TARDIS exploding, the universe is on the brink of destruction before the Doctor is able to escape the Pandorica. This ties back to the crack in the universe, and the explosion of the TARDIS creates the crack in the universe and serves as an impassable bridge between the Pandorica universe and the main universe. The Doctor reverts the universe back to the main universe by closing up the crack and erasing the existence of the Pandorica universe. The next pocket universe is a reoccurring one with Gallifrey, the home of the Doctor and his race, the Time Lords. Gallifrey is time-locked, meaning that you cannot time travel to the events that have already happened on Gallifrey. Time-locking an area makes it a pocket universe, which means that it can only be accessed through abnormal methods. This also makes sense because the Time Lords were time travelers, and so having the capability to travel back to a previous moment on Gallifrey would be very catastrophic for the Time Lords. This is why it's so difficult for the Doctor to enter Gallifrey after losing it in the Day of the Doctor. Gallifrey thus exists outside of the universe, being accessible through another crack in space and time in the Time of the Doctor, and later being visited in Hellbent and the Timeless Children via other methods. One of these methods is something of a pocket universe itself, with the Confession Dial being a method to accessing Gallifrey as it happens in Heaven Sent. The dial is a prison meant to trap anyone within while being interrogated. Time and space are differently affected within, as it's primarily Time Lord technology, and because of the resetting rooms and the nature of the world being very small, the Doctor is able to escape interrogation through looping through the same sequence of events over and over until successfully escaping into Gallifrey. So this behaves a lot like a pocket universe, and it's artificially created by the Time Lords. That's it for the pocket universes, but one more universe that behaves a lot like a pocket universe in that time and space rules are bent a bit, but doesn't exist within the main universe, is the Solitract universe. This universe was created by an entity called the Solitract, which exists outside of the scope of the main universe. Essentially, it's on the scale of like physics or mass or things like that. It's a fundamental force, and it's never meant to mix with the main universe. It creates its own universe and attempts to bridge that universe to the main universe, and it turns out to be impossible for things to exist from the main universe in the Solitract universe because their fundamental forces do not align at all, causing the collapse of both. So the Doctor prevents this by letting the Solitract universe collapse, saving the main universe. The last location that we need to talk about is the location that isn't a location. Whatever is not occupied by a timeline or a sub-universe of the main universe is called the Void. This is described as the location that exists between space and time, essentially a location where nothing can exist, no time flows, nothing happens. The Daleks use the Void to hide a sleeper cell that travels to the main timeline in the events of Doomsday. There's not much to talk about the Void other than it's there and it completes our definition of the universe. With that, I'll cap off this episode, and next time we will talk about some examples of determinism within the Doctor Who universe. As always, thank you for listening.